Good morning, church. How are we doing this morning? Good. All right. Well, we are in week number 1 of a brand new series called The Ripple Effect. And guess what we're doing for the next 3 weekends? We are dealing with everybody's favorite topic in church, money. Woohoo! Now, let me tell you something. I am no longer the lead pastor of this church, which, now means I don't have the reins on me that I used to. So you don't know what I'm going to say in this series. I've handed this off to Pastor Jesse Vaca, but I did pastor this church for 9 years. And let me tell you, over the course of 9 years, we have done a number of series that dealt with the topic of money and generosity. And what's been fascinating after doing this for years is that I've noticed some patterns. So let me tell you, there are 2 things that are going to be true in the next 3 weekends of this church, okay? Number 1, here's the first thing that will be true. Attendance will go down. Isn't that interesting? Now, why is that? Money runs deeper in our hearts than anything else in the world. Do you know that? It is the thing that most easily conquers our hearts, the thing that most easily competes for the seat of leading our lives. It competes with God. It tries to have authority over us. It sits on the nerve center of our life because we feel like money is our provision. It's our basis of support. It's our foundation in life. We tend to feel that way. And so when it gets discussed in church, it can easily touch a nerve in life. Money is one of the most challenging and difficult subjects to deal with. And so because of that, what happens every time we have a series that deals with the topic of money, generosity, giving, tithing, any of those types of things, we see some people who tend to run away because it's just too hard to deal with. But here's the other thing that you will discover to be true in this series. There will be more life change in this series than maybe almost any other we have this year. Every time we deal with the topic of money and generosity, here's what happens. There are people in our church who, for the very first time in their lives, step out and trust God. I'm telling you, for the first time, they trust God to be their provider instead of money being the foundation of their lives. And what they see happen is that God shows up in the most miraculous ways. God provides. God takes care of us. Every time we do this, we get waves of stories that come back from the church from people who reach out and say, I stepped out and began to give for the first time in my life, and let me tell you what God did. And it is revolutionary on people's lives. You want to see your faith grow? You want to see your belief in the bigness of God, the power of God grow? You want to see your trust in the Lord deepen? Let me tell you, there's almost no faster way to get there than to trust God with the financial resources that He has put into your hands and to give them over to Him. This series will change lives. Now, I'm telling you that because what I want to do is I want to try to bring down some of the anxiety in the room. The minute we start talking about money, it immediately builds up anxiety. And so I want to tell you something that's true, and I'm going to ask you just to trust me and to believe that what I'm telling you is true. Here's what's true. I don't want something from you. Our church doesn't want something from you. We want something for you. Because your life will be radically altered. The direction and the course of your life, your relationship with God will be transformed when God has your money. Let me tell you that that's true. There is something in this for you. Now, we titled this series The Ripple Effect because what I want you to understand, and we'll come back to this every week in the series, is that when you give toward the kingdom of heaven in any way, when you give to a church, when you give to a missionary, when you give to a nonprofit organization that's doing kingdom-driven work, when you give to families in poverty, when you give to widows, when you give to orphans, when you give to people of need, when you sponsor a child in a third world country, when you do any one of those things in the name of Jesus Christ, let me tell you what happens. There is a ripple effect that goes out. In the same way that if you were to take a giant rock and pitch it into a pond, you would only see that rock splash into the pond, and if you turned your back and walked away, you wouldn't see the waves that go out, but they're still there. When we give toward the kingdom of heaven in any kind of way, we just see the gift go in, and we don't necessarily know what happens next. But God causes a ripple effect to go out. And the rippling of our giving literally has eternal implications. It changes people's lives. It causes people to come to know Christ. It leads people into the kingdom of heaven. It leads people into a relationship with a God who loves them so dearly. There's a rippling impact to our giving. And I think if we understood how far out the ripples go, how many years out they may go, how wide they may go, how many people they may reach, we probably would not hesitate to give. If we could see from God's perspective the ripple effect of our giving. I want to tell you a story of a leader who had a tremendous ripple effect with his generosity. He is the most generous man I've ever known in my life, and you actually got to meet him last weekend because he preached on this stage. This is Pastor Greg Paris. He is a very good friend of mine. He preached our transition service last weekend as I handed off leadership to Pastor Jesse. And Greg's an extraordinary man, but let me tell you a really cool generosity story so you can think through the ripple effect of Greg's generosity. Around the year, somewhere in the window of 2015, Greg had been pastoring Union Chapel at that point, which is a big church in Muncie, Indiana, for about 30 years. Union Chapel had grown and grown and grown. They had become the largest church by far in Muncie, Indiana. They had grown to somewhere in the window of about 1,500 to 2,000 people. Like at their peak, they were about that high. But at the time that this story takes place, Union Chapel had been in some decline for a while. The church had been slowly just kind of stepping back as the years had gone on, and had gotten to the point where the church was still probably the biggest church in Muncie. It was a church of about 900 people at the time. The way Greg describes the story of what happens, he said, I was working out on a treadmill one day, just doing my normal workout, and he said, I can't even describe it. He said, the Holy Spirit knocked me off the treadmill and put me on my face on the floor. He said, I knew that I needed to be on the floor before God. And he said, God spoke to me and told me that I was to spend my last decade of pastoring Union Chapel, not trying to grow the church back up larger, but I needed to spend my last decade giving resources away to church planters so that churches could be launched around the United States. What's fascinating about that story is that sometimes God calls us to be a generous person even when we're at a low point. He doesn't always call us when we're at a high point. He called Pastor Greg at a low point in the church's life cycle. But Greg was obedient and he said yes. And we became the very first church that got planted out of Union Chapel. We were church number one. The second church was Pastor Paul Erminger. He was on their staff at the time. He moved to Cape Coral, Florida, launched Gulfside Church in Cape Coral. And then church after church after church began to get planted. Greg started casting vision for his church, and they got to the point where they were giving $400,000 a year away to church plants. Do you know how much you can do for your own church with $400,000? You can send out lots and lots of mail pieces. You can run commercials to try to invite people in. You can run ads on the radio. You can run Facebook ads. You can run massive community events. You can do a lot. You can hire a bunch of staff with $400,000. Yet they were giving it away for the kingdom of heaven. And what happened over his last 10 years there is that about 30 churches got planted. And I want you to consider the rippling impact of Pastor Greg's generosity. Because he chose not to focus on his own ministry and the growth of his own thing that he was leading, but he focused on something bigger than himself. Not only did 30 churches get planted, but those 30 churches became the foundation of the 99 Network, which is the nonprofit organization I'm now leading. Our dream in the next 20 years is to try to plant 1,000 churches across this country. And to help you to understand the impact of what one church plant can do, you know, our church was launched here 9 years ago. We have seen probably about 1,000 people come to Jesus in the last 9 years. That's just one, right? And you think about that. You multiply that out over all the churches that are going to go out across the United States because of what started at Union Chapel. And can you start to see the ripple impact of giving? The ripple effect that goes out. Every time you give, God does something bigger than you understand. There's a ripple effect to your generosity. This morning, I want to take you into two incredible stories in the Bible. I'm going to tell you the stories of two extraordinary women who had a ripple effect with their giving. These women lived 800 years apart in history. They never got to meet each other, although I'm sure they met each other once they made it to the kingdom of heaven, and they both celebrated the fact that they got two pretty cool stories in the Bible about them. These women had two things in common about them. Number one, they were both widows. Now, it is hard to be a widow today in 2025. it was unbelievably hard to be a widow thousands of years ago in biblical history. Women in the scriptures often were undereducated, often did not have access to much in the way of financial resources and economic opportunities. They relied on their husbands to provide for them. In fact, that's why in God's law, there was a command in the Old Testament law that if a woman lost her husband, the brother of that husband was to marry the widow, because women didn't have another way to be provided for. So God was providing a way to care for widows. You see, it was a big deal to be a widow. It put you in the worst circumstances in life if that was the case. And so the two ladies I'm going to tell you about this morning were both widows. That's the first thing they have in common. The second thing they have in common is that they trusted God on a level that most of us will never know in our lives. They had a level of trust in the provision of God that we should all be longing for and hoping to have in our lives. Their level of belief and trust in the Lord was absolutely extraordinary. Now, I'm going to tell you these two stories. The first story shows up in the book of 1 Kings chapter 17. The context of 1 Kings 17 is that there's this famous prophet named Elijah. He has managed to absolutely tick off the worst king in Israel's history, a guy by the name of Ahab. Ahab did everything wrong as a king. Terrible, horrible, no good, very bad dude. He was killing off the Lord's prophets. He was instituting the foreign gods from foreign nations to come in and be the gods of Israel. He was doing everything wrong. And so God got mad at Ahab, and God raised up his prophet Elijah and said, I want you to go to Ahab and declare that there's going to be a drought on the land. No rain until I say it's going to rain again. So Elijah does that, and a drought begins. And when that drought gets maybe, I don't know how long, maybe it got 6 months in, where it got to the point where Ahab realized, hey, this is for real, and that idiot Elijah is the one who caused it, he started going after Elijah and made it his mission to try to kill Elijah. So Elijah, where we find him in 1 Kings 17, is that he's been hiding out in the mountains. There's like a brook coming down through the mountains. He sits by it every day. This brook is his water source. And every day, ravens are going out, they're picking up dead animals that have been killed, and they're bringing them back, and they're dropping them at Elijah's feet, and that's his food source. So he's eating food, he's eating meat, and he's drinking water by this brook. Well, the drought goes on and on and on, and eventually the brook dries up. And all of a sudden, the water source is cut off, and he's in desperation. And Elijah doesn't know what to do. And so God tells him that he's going to raise up an extraordinary woman to help him. Now, if you were God in this situation, or if I were God, and you saw your prophet Elijah, who had worked with you to bring the drought on Israel, and you knew that you needed to find somebody to provide for Elijah, who would you have chosen to do that? I know what I would do if I were God. I would go after the wealthiest Israelite I could find who still loved me as God, right? I would find somebody who had an abundance of financial resources, somebody who had a huge plot of land, that they had the money to dig a deep well to go find a water source underground to be able to drink out of. That's who I would have used to provide for Elijah. But God chooses to do something very surprising. He raises up this woman that we don't even know her name. We only know her as the widow at Zarephath. He used a widow to be the one to provide for Elijah. Here's how the story goes. 1 Kings 17, chapter 9 says this, that God said to Elijah, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. A widow. A woman who needs a husband to provide for her because the conditions of the day don't allow her to have hardly any resources to her name. She is the one who's going to be called by God to provide for the prophet Elijah. So Elijah goes. Verse 10, so he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and he asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, he called, and please, bring me, please, a piece of bread. So he's hungry and he's thirsty. Here he is in Zarephath, and this woman with no husband is now going to get him water. Now, what she is about to say next is absolutely amazing to me. I don't know if you have ever been in your life in the level of desperation that this woman was in her life, but she was at the absolute end of her resources and had no idea where anything was going to be provided from next. If you've ever been in a situation like that, you know what it's like to have to cast yourself into the hands of God and to trust God to catch you, right? So here's what she says next, verse 12. Here's what she speaks back to the prophet. As surely as your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread. I only have a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. And I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Can you imagine being in that level of desperation in your life? You know, we all try to have an abundance of resources to our name, don't we? We want bank accounts full of money. We want retirement accounts so that someday we can step away from work and have the ability to continue to live. I think one of the worst fears that all of us have is the possibility of coming to our last resource while we are still living, right? That's a pretty terrifying prospect, isn't it? And praise God that most of us are not in that situation, that there will be enough resources to always go to the end of our days. But some people get there, where they get down to their last resource and they don't know where anything is coming from next. That's where this woman was at. She is in a place of absolute desperation. She is preparing for the death of both her and her son because she doesn't know where anything's going to come from. And now this prophet comes along and asks her to give the very last of what she has to him. What's she going to do? Well, the Lord speaks a word to Elijah to bring to the woman, to tell her what will happen if she will trust God and give. Here's what he says, verse 14. Elijah spoke these words. He said, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day that the Lord sends rain on the land. Now, let me tell you something. Some of you have experienced the jar of oil not running dry, the jar of flour not running dry in your life when you learn to give for the first time. I'm telling you, every Christian I know who has learned how to give has experienced some version of the jar of oil not running dry. It is unbelievable how much your faith in God begins to change when you see the jar of oil refuse to run dry in your life. It's amazing. And so this woman now had a decision. Was she going to step out and trust God to provide for her, or was she going to use the last of her resources for herself? And so what does she do? Verse 15 tells us what happens. She went away and she did as Elijah told her. And look what happened. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. Check this out. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. This is where your faith begins to be transformed. Which is why I'm saying to you that I don't want something from you. I want something for you. When you learn to trust God with money, not only does it unseat the power of money in your life, and all of a sudden God sits on the throne of your life instead of money sitting there. I'm telling you, it radically alters the way you view God when the jar of oil does not run dry. For Pastor Greg, he said yes to church planting. He said it at a low moment in their church when they had declined down probably to about the halfway point of what they had been at their peak. It was a very difficult season of ministry for him, of seeing the church having gone through decline. He says yes to God, and over the next 10 years, they start raising money and raising money and raising money. And here's what's amazing. When their focus stopped being on their own church and their own growth as a church and started being outward, not only did the jar of oil not run dry for Union Chapel, the jar filled up. The church grew and grew and grew and grew and grew over the next 10 years. He ended up handing the church off 2 years ago to his successor. The church now today is touching about 3,000 people in Muncie, Indiana. Isn't that amazing? You see, when their eyes got off of themselves and their eyes got on the greater kingdom, the jar just kept filling and filling and filling. This is what happens when we give. We see the ripple effect not only hit our own lives, but there's an eternal ripple effect that goes out and starts touching the lives of all kinds of other people. Now, there's a second woman who demonstrates this story. We come to the New Testament 800 years later, and now we have Jesus in the final week of his life. And in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, there's this wild story where Jesus is at the temple, and he's observing people giving. Now, this is a moment where Jesus has managed to tick everybody off around him, okay? Jesus is preparing for his death. So he's showing up at the temple every day in Jerusalem. He has driven out money changers with a whip. He is preaching, he's teaching, he's healing people. People are declaring him to be the Messiah, the Son of God. He's not denying it. And so he's got all the religious leaders mad. They are looking for a way to kill him. And now he's sitting in the court of this section of the temple called the Court of the Women. Let me explain what that was. So again, in the ancient world, women did not have the same rights they have today. They didn't have the same access they have today. They didn't have the same career prospects they have today. And that was reflected even in the way the temple was built in Jerusalem. So in the temple, there was a big section of the temple where both men and women could come into. It was called the Court of the Women, but then there was a wall that only the men could go deeper into the temple and get closer to what would have been considered the presence of God, which was housed in the Holy of Holies in the temple. There was a section that only the men could go into. So in the Court of the Women, the temple leaders had figured out that, hey, if we're going to collect an offering, because people would come to the temple to give their offering, we better make it easy on people to give. So we're not going to put the offering baskets in the male-only section. We're going to put it in the section where everybody can come into. We're not just going to put one offering basket out. We're going to install 13 of them around the walls, so it's very, very easy for people to come and give their gifts to the Lord at the temple. So they made it as easy as possible. So Jesus is sitting there with his disciples just watching people give. And what he's watching is that all of these very wealthy people are coming in, and they're putting in large sums of money into the 13 receptacles that were installed in the Court of the Women. All right? And so here's how the story goes. Let me jump forward to Mark chapter 12. It says this: as Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were being put, and he watched the crowd putting the money into the temple treasury. Now here's what it says next. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came in and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. So all these people with tremendous resources are coming in and they're giving at the temple. But then this widow comes in. She is 800 years behind the other widow in history. She had never met the other widow, the widow at Zarephath, but she had probably read her story or heard her story taught in the synagogues, because our Old Testament is what they would have taught in the synagogues in Jesus' day. So she probably was familiar. She probably knew the story of how God, hundreds of years earlier, had provided for another widow by causing the jar of flour and the jar of oil to never run dry when she gave to the prophet. And so she believed something that most of us struggle to believe. She believed that God was in control of all the resources of the world, and that God would willingly open his hand and provide resources if she would trust him with what she had. So she comes into the temple, and out of her poverty, she gives 2 very small copper coins. Now this morning, when you came in, you had this card sitting on your seat. This is a replica of what one of those coins would have looked like. So she gave 2 of these guys right here. All right, turns out you can buy these on Amazon, just so you know. And so she gave a couple of these. Now Jesus now is so impressed with what he sees that he actually looks at her as giving more than the people who had given all the money. So he calls his disciples together because he wants them to get how significant it is that she has just done this. So he pulls his guys together, and verse 43, here's what he said. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything." You have to have in God to give the last of what you have to his kingdom. And she did it. She was throwing herself into the hands of God. You see, this is what's amazing. It's a blessing from the Lord to have a lot. It is a blessing from God to have full bank accounts, full retirement accounts, vehicles paid off, houses paid off, abundance of resources. That's a blessing from the Lord. But you know what? There's another blessing from the Lord. And as strange as this sounds, poverty in the weirdest way can be its own unique blessing. You know why? Because people who battle with poverty have a trust in the Lord that most of us could only dream of having. A faith in God, a trust in His provision. You could almost make the argument that we ought to be asking for it because it would cause us to trust in the Lord. You see, Jesus' kingdom is so counterintuitive, so upside down from how we look at normal life. He wants us to know the goodness of God and the provision of God. And this woman had it. Now, church, I want you to consider the rippling impact of this woman. Here's what's amazing about the story. If I were sitting there in that temple and I saw her giving her last 2 coins, I would have run over to her and said, ma'am, you do not have to give. All these big hitters over here, they've given a lot. It's going to be okay. They're going to survive without your 2 copper coins. That's what I would have told her. Guess what Jesus does not do? He doesn't do what I would have done. He doesn't stop her from giving because he understood the rippling impact of her gift. Not only that, Jesus never even introduces himself to her. She doesn't even know him. You realize that this woman had no idea the significance of what she was doing that day. She eventually died. She eventually went to the kingdom of heaven. She eventually met the resurrected Jesus Christ in the kingdom of heaven. And he probably put his arm around her and said, let me tell you something, girlfriend. You have no idea what I did. And he probably marched her over and said, I inspired this guy named Mark to write about you. Look what he wrote about you. Her story is rippling down through history 2,000 years later. Do you understand how many millions, probably even billions of Christians have been inspired for the last 2 millenniums to give generously because of her? She had no idea on the day she gave what the rippling impact of her giving would be. Yet here we are 2,000 years later, and we're going to become more generous toward the kingdom because of her story. That's the ripple effect, isn't it? You know, you have this kind of effect. You have this kind of effect when you give. You know, we learn an amazing lesson from these 2 widows, and I want to help you to understand it. In fact, we put it on this card because I wanted you to walk home and be able to put this somewhere in your life where you would remember it. Here's the lesson from the widows. It's not about how much I give. It's about the condition of my heart when I give. They both gave so little that if you and I were a big Fortune 500 company and we were counting their giving, we would just write it off as 0. It was nothing. It was so minuscule and small by comparison to what others were giving, yet it is viewed as the greatest of giving. You see, God is not concerned about how much I give. Do you know that God doesn't need your giving? He doesn't need your money. Do you know that? What he wants is your heart. He's concerned about the condition of your heart. And when we give, it's not about the amount. It's about the condition of our hearts that are reflected in the transformation of our hearts that come through the process of giving. That's what God really wants. He wants your heart to be fully devoted to him. He wants you to trust him and to love him and to know him and to believe that he can always be your provider. So church, we're going to go into an offering moment as a church now. I want to invite our ushers to come forward. As we go into this offering moment, I want to ask you to start praying about something these next few weeks. This is the time of year, every year, where our church experiences a provision through the members of our church. All of the ministry of the upcoming year gets powered through what happens in the month of December. It's not uncommon for us to see sometimes 20 to 25% of all the giving for the church come in one single month. And so I'm going to ask you to begin praying about something. Would you start praying about a year-end gift? Would you start praying about having a rippling impact for 2026 and beyond through a generous gift to our church? We're going to reach people for Christ. We're going to grow. We're going to see more youth show up on Sunday nights. More people turn their hearts and their lives to Jesus, more baptisms happening in our church because of the impact and the rippling effect of our giving. So I'm going to pray over our offering now, and we're going to have an opportunity to respond to this message. Come on, let's go ahead and pray. Oh, Lord Jesus, we all need a deeper dependence and trust on you. And God, this morning you gave us two extraordinary stories in your word of two widows who had so little to give, yet they trusted you in a way that most of us have never known. God, we want their faith. We want their trust. We want their dependence upon you. We want the kind of mountain-moving faith that these women had. And God, we can have that as we learn to give. So God, inspire us to give, not just to our church. Inspire us to give to the widows that we see in our lives. Inspire us to give to the people in poverty around us. Inspire us, Lord, to give to missionaries. Inspire us to give to Christian schools. Inspire us to give to anything that would move the kingdom of heaven forward. I pray that we would experience the joy of allowing you to have authority and victory over money in our lives. So God, now we're going to respond through our own generosity and our own giving, and we're going to trust you. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.